Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. If you want contrasts in this election, boy, do we have them. Last week, the president spent his time overseas talking about democracy, talking about decency, talking about standing up to tyranny, representing the United States on the world stage. There was no better example of Biden's ability to navigate the requirements of the presidency as commander-in-chief, as a eloquent spokesman, frankly, for the United States, and also someone who deeply understands, is imbued with American values. So you saw that on one half of the screen. And then you have Trump, who on Monday was required to meet with his probation officer. Just stop and think about that. How bizarre is it that someone who has to meet with his probation officer wants to be president of the United States, and millions of people want to help him do that? It's just beyond belief. There was also another Looney Tunes rally that Trump held in the extreme heat in Arizona over the weekend, in which you got the whole panoply of crazy. This was a guy who literally said, "I don't care about you people. I just want your votes." This was a guy who insulted whoever put together his sound system and his teleprompter by saying, "This is shitty work. I don't pay people who do shitty work." He, of course, is infamous for not paying workers. He also had this long diatribe deciding whether he would rather be eaten by sharks or electrocuted. I don't know if I have a preference, but this is insanity. This is the kind of unhinged, self-absorbed craziness that this guy spews. And of course, now he is talking almost nonstop about vengeance, about prosecuting his enemies. It's not because they've done anything wrong, of course. It's simply because he was prosecuted. Now, this has been the problem for Republicans all along. James Comer and the House Republicans have tried to drum up some basis for impeachment against President Biden, but of course there isn't any. He's not done anything illegal. He's not committed any high crimes and misdemeanors. He didn't instill an insurrectionist. He didn't, for example, threaten to cut off aid to Ukraine in exchange for getting his opponent in some kind of smear campaign, caught up in some kind of smear campaign that the Ukrainians were supposed to come up with. Trump projects because he is, of course, the subject now of innumerable investigations. He's been found liable of rape. He's been found liable in a civil case of defamation. He's been found guilty of 34 criminal counts. He has other criminal cases pending. So to him, this looks like persecution. To the rest of us, it looks like a crime spree, and it should be absolutely disqualifying. And aside from President Biden, who is making the affirmative case for voting for a president who has American values, what a concept, you have Vice President Harris, who is doing a really good job in various settings in making clear there's no place for a convicted felon in the White House. There's no place for someone who wants to use office to exact judgment and exact revenge on his opponents. She had a very good appearance on Jimmy Kimmel, frankly, where she did this in a serious way, but in an informal setting. And she did it again in Michigan, when she made the case that you cannot have someone who has broken the law, and she might have added, and also been cited for contempt innumerable times because he has no impulse control, in the Oval Office. It's inconsistent with the requirements of the office. So it should be absolutely clear as day to people which person is on the side of America, on the side of freedom, and which is not. And you have to come to the realization that people who haven't made that decision are either completely checked out right now. They've forgotten what Trump is. They don't listen. They don't watch the news. Or this is what they want. that they are channeling their worst selves, their most evil impulses, their resentment, their anger, their sense that their life is not exciting or complete through Trump. And he is giving them this thrill of excitement, this sense of power, this sense of superiority that they crave. And we've seen this before. All dictators do this. All authoritarians do this. They imbue their followers with a sense of mission, that anything is justified because they have been wrong. On one hand, they are superior. On the other hand, they are victims. And this strange tension is playing out every day in the Trump campaign. Now, meanwhile, in the real world, the war in Gaza has continued. And it was fascinating to see over the weekend two developments. First of all, there was a daring daytime rescue of 4 hostages who had been held for over 9 months in Hamas. And we don't know whether all of the time was spent in these apartment buildings, but at least some of it was. Understand this, apartment buildings where civilians live. There were 2 households where they were being held, this group of 4 people. Were the people who were housing them willing participants? Were they doing this against their will? Whatever the reason, by making civilians into combatants, into participation in the fight against Israel, Hamas has made them legitimate targets. I want to repeat that. You lose the right to protection under international law when you give up the role of civilian bystander and you become a participant, an enabler, an adjunct to, in this case, the terrorists. So the people who are crying crocodile tears that people were killed in the course of this rescue operation. First of all, we don't know how many there really are because we've learned that the Hamas figures are not reliable. Secondly, we don't know how many of these were terrorists or terrorist helpmates who were firing back at the Israelis. And this cannot be simply a numbers game. It's not the same. They have lost the protection of the rule of law, of international law, because they have committed war crimes and because they have involved citizens, or civilians rather, from Gaza. And the people who are gnashing their teeth over the civilian, I put in quotation marks, casualties, really? Do you not see the completely inverted emotional and moral equation that you've set up here? No, it's not the Israelis' job to protect civilians who are now acting as combatants. It's Hamas's war crimes that put them in that position. And yet you have a whole flock of apologists for Hamas running around decrying that 200, or however many people it is, were killed in the course of this rescue operation. Remember, the war started with a war crime, the attack on civilians, the rape of civilians, the kidnapping of civilians. It has continued as a war crime as these hostages are held against the restrictions of international war. It's been a war crime that they've been mistreated. It's a war crime to bring them into a civilian environment. And it's a war crime to put civilians in harm's way. So I think we need to kind of rethink the moral equation here. And just to point out how bizarre things have gotten. There was a protest at the White House over the weekend. Now, many in the media labeled this pro-Gaza or pro-Palestinian. Really? These people were calling Jews pigs. They were calling for jihad. They were inviting Hamas and Hezbollah to kill, quote, Zionists. This was an explicit identification with, one participant said, sympathizing with Hamas. This is nothing but support and cheerleading for terrorists. This is not about human rights. This is not achieving dignity for the Palestinians. This is about killing Jews, and this is making excuses for terrorists. And the people in the media who have been insisting, no, it's not about that. It's all about the Palestinians. Where were they? Why did they not come forward to condemn this? Why did they not say, this is not what we are all about? We condemn this in the strongest terms. Silence. Chirping birds. There's been a serious moral collapse among some in the course of this war. And I think we need to get our bearings. I think we need to remember who started the war. I think we need, yes, to apply pressure to Israel to make sure, to the greatest extent possible, they don't involve actual civilians, innocents, who have no role in the fighting. They need to increase the amount of humanitarian aid. And in fact, they've done those things after pressure from this administration. And remember, Israel accepted the ceasefire proposal that President Biden put out. Yes, they accepted it. And if you had any doubts, you could have listened to Jake Sullivan this weekend, who was on the Sunday shows, who said, Israel accepted it. It's now up to Hamas. So all these people shouting, ceasefire now, go tell it to Hamas, because that's where the problem lies. As Jake Sullivan said, if Hamas said, we're done, release the hostages, the war would end today. So I think we can't forget who did what and who's responsible for what. And as much as we sympathize, agonize for the real civilian population of Gaza, we cannot show sympathy. We should not be encouraging the terrorists, and we should not be making apologies for them. So hopefully the last few days will be somewhat clarifying for the American people. I certainly hope so. But if not, and we go down this road, perhaps we should rethink those student protesters and those encampments on college campuses. Remember, they denied that it was all about anti-Semitism. They denied that they were targeting Jews because they were Jews. This was all about Palestinian self-determination. Maybe not. Maybe that's what we've learned. So contrasts between the presidential candidates, contrasts between the sides in a grotesque, awful war, and we are left in the United States with a Supreme Court that is about to unfurl a whole series of opinions. They're going to be terrible, so brace yourself. And we're soon going to get Trump's sentencing hearing, so we'll see whether he gets jail time or not. And the election will go on. Because the only thing that stops Donald Trump, the only thing to reassert American values, to make sure the authoritarians don't prevail, is defeating Donald Trump. And that's what all of us have to do. Did you know that learning actually makes a sound? No, it's not the wheels turning in your head. It's true. Listen. That's the sound of you becoming a better you by learning a new language with Babbel 2024. Babbel is a science-backed language learning app that actually works because it's designed by real people for real conversations. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Instead, have a fun learning with Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons that are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, and rooted in real-life situations. Plus, they're all delivered with a conversation-based teaching method, so you'll be ready to start using what you've learned in the real world in no time at all. Right now, I'm using Babbel to learn Spanish. It's easy and so much fun. It's like playing a game on your phone. I'm already feeling more confident, and I love putting my new skills to the test. It's the perfect excuse to go to I don't know, cocoon. But the only question is where your life is going to take you when you pick up new language skills with Babbel. Babbel even has speech recognition technology to help you improve your pronunciation and accent so you're ready to make new connections. Here's what it's like.
Adiós.
Adios.
Hola.
Hola.
Adiós.
Adios.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Studies from Yale, Michigan State, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study even found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel already has over 16 million subscriptions sold, and all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. And here's a special limited deal for my listeners. Right now, you get 55% off your Babbel subscription, but only for my listeners at babbel.com/greenroom. Again, get 55% off at babbel.com/greenroom, spelled BABBEL.com/greenroom. Rules and restrictions may apply, and you can find the link in the show notes. As we observe the 2024 election and the Trump era in general, I've often encouraged my listeners and readers to view this as we would a European or Central or South American country in which a leader came to power by election, but then slowly turned the society into a totalitarian, personalized regime. That, I think, is what Donald Trump tried to do in the first term and what he has explicitly said he would do in the second term. So I think it behooves us to study and to understand how it is that these other regimes around the world come to power through popular elections, but nevertheless descend into something that pretty much resembles an authoritarian, abusive government. We have lots of examples, and the perfect person to talk to us about that and explain this phenomenon is the interim president of Freedom House, Nicole Bibbins Sedaca. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here.
I often ask my readers and my listeners to think of our present situation in the United States in the context of the global phenomenon. We have a number of countries around the world that Freedom House has tracked that may have come into power, the regimes, by a democratic election. But then they have engaged in what you and others have called democratic backsliding. And they come to resemble not democracies, but more like totalitarian countries. And they become sort of mixed or hybrid democracies. Tell us a little bit about why this phenomenon has happened. What do you think is going on in the world that causes, in different countries, not having a tremendous amount to do with one another, this same phenomenon of a democratic election followed by a move towards authoritarianism?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question and a great one to start with. We see in a number of countries, people who are elected, free and fair elections, they come to power, but their commitment actually to democracy is weak or non-existent in some cases. And what they do is they use the very system that brought them to power. They use that system to manipulate what are supposed to be the healthy, normal checks and balances that exist in a democracy to consolidate power. Because at the end of the day, democracy is about sharing the power and putting in power in the people's hands and allowing them to make decisions. What we see for people who are illiberal leaders or authoritarian-minded leaders, they would like to consolidate the power so they never have to go through the process of making the case to the people more than once. I'm thinking about countries like Hungary, where we have seen Viktor Orban's party orchestrating constitutional and legal changes to consolidate control over independent institutions. He built a supermajority in parliament that enabled restrictions on the political opposition, media, NGOs, courts, private sector. And it's just one example of where we see someone who came to power through a legitimate democratic process then fail to respect and uphold that democratic norm in how he governed.
Often these people tell us what they are up to before they get into power. There are some hints about what they're up to. What are the kinds of promises, the kinds of things they say that should set off alarm bells for average people?
Yes, we see many leaders really signal what they're going to do, and quite often they do it through the tools that we see from populist leaders. The question I often get is, isn't populism just good? It's the popular interest. Well, it's actually when a leader takes what's a popular sentiment. People are upset about the economy. They're upset about a social issue. And instead of actually addressing the economy, addressing the social issue, addressing what the people are really upset about, the leader takes that discontent and starts to dismantle and blame different parts of the society that they say are the root cause of that thing that they should actually govern around. So what they often will do is they will blame an opposition party. And therefore, going after the opposition party then looks like you're dealing with the discontent. But in actuality, you're consolidating your power by going after the opposition party. They may also say, well, the media is to blame for your discontent, or these elite universities are to blame for your discontent. So they are able to grab the discontent, and instead of governing the way they should to deal with that discontent, they're blaming these institutions, and they will say quite often during campaigns and leading up, well, if we could just get rid of the media, if we could just shut down these universities, if we could just get rid of this opposition, which is not patriotic, it doesn't care about you, it wants to undermine you and fuel this discontent. What people then feel is, wow, she's really addressing my discontent. They're taking their eye off of the need for real public policies to address the discontent, and they're putting their eyes on what those populist leaders are doing, which is to say, let's go after these institutions or these parts of our society. And so that demonization, which you'll see during campaigns, which is to say the real problem is these people who are not patriots, they are not committed to you. Those are sort of crumbs that we see placed on the path to illiberal leaders or to populist leaders taking power.
Now, some of the rhetoric that we hear from these people is meant for public consumption. But there are also those aspects of society who think they can cut a deal with the strong man or the would-be authoritarian. They say, well, we know that's a bunch of gibberish, but I'm a big business leader, perhaps I have mines or I have railroads or whatever it may be. I can make a deal with this guy, so I'm going to go along. Or if I'm the church, I say, hey, I don't believe all this hogwash, but hey, he's talking about family values, or he's talking about returning women to the home. We like that. We're going to go along with that. How is it that institutions within society that are a little bit more sophisticated convince themselves that this would be a good thing, and they wind up enabling a figure that ultimately is going to be very destructive and maybe destructive towards them when push comes to shove?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Quite often, every institution, you've named businesses, you've named religious organizations, their labor organizations, they are very self-interested. All of us are. All of us belong to different groups, and we're interested in that. It is when we put those interests fully above the democratic health of our society that we get into a dangerous place. Because the reality is, if we cut a deal, whether we're a business person or a religious organization or a secular organization or a labor organization, and we say, gosh, we're going to bend the rules, we're going to be okay with the bending of democratic norms because it benefits me, what we're doing is eroding the very protections that actually protect our right to do anything. right? So I've been in the religious freedom field for a long time. I'm a very big believer of the need to protect all people of faith, people of no faith, and the right to convert between different beliefs. But if I were to say, I'm only going to protect one faith, but not the other, but I'm on the in group, there's nothing then down the line that protects me from the next leader who says, well, you're in the out group. You didn't protect that. Now my other group is in. That's where by eroding those democratic norms, we're actually eroding the very protections to ourselves. If I'm a business person, I say, oh, this is going to be great for my railroad. If I'm bending those rules, the rule of law, the right to sue, the right to have contracts signed and mean something, there's nothing that protects the next person from taking advantage of my railroad and saying, well, your contract doesn't matter, or you can't sue fairly in a court. So we're basically undermining our own protections. Even if we gain in the short term, we're really undermining that protection, which protects all of us equally over the longer term.
One of the things I'm particularly interested in, because we see it in our own democracy, is how these leaders interact with the courts. Courts are supposed to be independent of the executive. They're supposed to be a brake on power and keep democratic norms from going off the rails. Talk to us a little bit about how courts' independence is eroded or corrupted, and what that ultimately means for the protection of democratic norms.
Absolutely. Courts playing an important check on the executive branch and on other parts of the society is a sign of a healthy democracy. We need those checks and balances. We need the oversight, the accountability, and it really is a pillar of a democratic system of governance. And it really also protects basic human rights by safeguarding due process. When the courts are captured by a different branch of government, or when they are beholden to something other than the Constitution or the body of law, then they no longer are serving that important check and balance role. Because at the end of the day, they're not supposed to be beholden to one political party or one political leader or a social movement or any other body. They are the protectors of the rules that govern all of us, and which are also supposed to protect each of us as well. And so that's what we've seen in some countries, is that conflation of an independent judiciary, which no longer becomes independent and becomes a political arm or aligned and willing to bend the rules for the sake of a political party or a political figure.
And we certainly saw this in Hungary and in Poland as well, where one of the first victims of this kind of regime was the judiciary. It also seems that in well-functioning democracies and in civil societies, we all have independent codes of conduct. Doctors have codes of conduct, lawyers have independent codes, judges have codes, priests, rabbis have codes. But an authoritarian doesn't want you to pay attention to these other areas of responsibility. They want you to have a single allegiance to the central government, to him personally. Talk to us a little bit about how civil society functions in a healthy way to kind of restrain this accumulation of power, and what happens when they start chiseling away and tell judges, no, you're not supposed to uphold your judicial oath, or they tell media, no, you don't get to protect your sources. Talk to us a little bit about that dynamic, which seems to be so potent in the way consolidation of power happens.
Absolutely. A healthy democracy has a healthy civil society. That healthy civil society has access to information through a free and professionalized media. It has access to the accountability mechanisms on their leaders, which means I can write to my congressperson or I can vote them out of office. That's what a healthy civil society can do. We can also organize. So if we are, moms whose children suffer from one particular disease, we can organize around that. Or if there are labor violations, we can organize around that. Or if we're a faith group, we can organize around that. Those are all healthy means in a healthy democracy to express what the desire of the people are. That's a lot of pressure on a leader because they have to then be accountable to these people who are asking for that which is most important to them, whether that's a healthcare reform or whether that is something that protects their community in one way or another. And so leaders who know that people have interests and are pulling in different ways, they want to really close that space, because the more that space is vibrant and vocal and debating things in the public square, the more pressure they have and the more accountable they have to be to the people to maintain their power, if that power is actually derived from the people. But if you close that space, if people are silenced, if people don't have the opportunity to raise those concerns, well, then as a leader, you're always right. You're always doing well, because you're never on the hot seat to address the issues which are on people's minds. I'm thinking also just about some cases where we've seen judicial independence actually captured and that space closed. We've seen it in El Salvador, for example, where they purged the constitutional chamber of their highest court, the Supreme Court, about 3 years ago, and they replaced all of the judges with government loyalists. And then the President Bukele, who is the president of El Salvador, was able to bypass all of the constitutional requirements and was able to they didn't have to listen to the people. They didn't have to listen to what many of the civil society and many of the legal experts were saying as they were pushing back on him. And he was able to run very successfully to a second term. That's where we see this erosion of the institutions that are supposed to be those checks and balances. And the interesting thing is democracy is really messy, but it's intentionally messy. And it's messy because if you think about the United States, we're over 300 million people. We're not all going to believe the same, live the same, believe the same things, but it's intentionally messy to try and force those conversations and to try and force a government to be responsive to the whole of the people. And where we see leaders closing that space and often arguing that messiness is the problem, where they're able to say, no, see that, look at those democracies. They're so chaotic. They're so messy. We're able to close this space. Not so many people talking, not so many, journalists reporting all these different things. Let's just have a closer society. That's where they're able to consolidate and close that power. And then ultimately it erodes all of the civil society space, which is where all of us are able to have our voices heard.
These regimes that are sliding into a totalitarian or a hybrid system are often very corrupt, financially speaking.
Yes.
What's the connection between financial corruption and the consolidation of political power?
Absolutely. When a democratic system functions well, the revenue which is garnered from the people, the taxes, right? That's all of us pay taxes. And that actually is our way of buying into a system that then serves us with the services that are provided. When that money is skimmed off and it is provided directly to the benefit of the power of the regime, then the people no longer are paying into sort of the social contract that exists between them and the government. Then that is just money that is going into the coffers of the regime. And then the regime also then no longer has to be accountable to the people on how that money is spent. Because realistically, all of us are taxpayers. We ask for things. We want our roads to be paved. We want our schools to run. We want those things which are the services. But if that money is taken out of the system, and a leader is able to function, they have their own bank account in essence, and they have their own cronies around them, they no longer have to worry about being accountable to people. They have their own pot of money that, as long as they are keeping their friends, family, and those close to them in power, they don't ever have to deliver on those things. And so what we see in a lot of countries is authoritarian leaders who are not at all in any way delivering on what the basic services are for the people. They are garnering those resources either from the people, from external sources, sometimes even from international assistance or other places, or through corrupt criminal gangs, right, through narco trafficking or other sort of criminal enterprises. And that becomes their coffer that they are able to keep themselves in power and keep those around them loyal to them and keeping them in power as well.
Now, one of the tremendous assets of Freedom House is that you track all of this stuff. You track press freedoms, you track democracies. It's not been a pretty picture over the last decade or so. Talk to us a little bit about globally what pattern you see, and why you think that pattern has really been fairly consistent, unfortunately, over the last 10, 20 years.
Absolutely. We have tracked for the last 50 years how every country and territory in the world is doing as far as how people are experiencing political and civil rights. It's our report called Freedom in the World that we put out every year. Unfortunately, for the last 18 years, we have reported that there is consistent and consecutive democratic decline in the world, which means there are more countries or territories in which people are experiencing fewer political rights and civil rights protection than countries where it is improving. There are a few things that I would point to it. Authoritarian leaders are upping their game. They are cracking down. Where we see a lot of backsliding is actually in those countries. They are getting tighter and tighter. They are cracking down more on opposition, on journalists, on civil society organizations. And so they are not only cracking down at home, they are also taking their repression on the road. They are exercising what we call transnational repression, which is going after opposition and other people outside of their country. We see them undermining elections around the world. So authoritarians have really figured out we've got to up our game, because it's the only way we're going to stay in power is we really close down at home and we take our game on the road. Secondly, we see countries that were consolidated or consolidating democracies. They had been on a democratic path for 10, 20, 30 years, hit a rough spot. And in many cases, those democracies were not delivering at the pace or in the way that many of the people wanted. And what that did is it gave rise to populist leaders to use those democratic institutions to come to power. But then instead of addressing those discontents where democracy wasn't delivering fast enough, they used it again to dismantle and keep themselves in power. The other, I would say, is that long-term democracies, and I would include the United States in this, have faced our own challenges. We have had challenges at home. Some of those are demographic challenges. Some of those are illiberal leaders. Some of those are people who are willing to undermine democracy themselves. And so when you have this constellation of authoritarians getting stronger, democracies really turning inward to deal with some of their problems and not taking it to the road and not really realizing the urgency. And then some of those countries that are in between really also struggling. You really do see that decline over 18 years.
Now, there are examples where, lo and behold, an authoritarian regime has gotten into power. They've backpedaled and democratic protections have declined. But lo and behold, the democratic forces band together and they recaptured their government. We recently saw this, for example, in Poland, which was extraordinary. How do they do it? What's the secret to getting these regimes out of power?
There's not one secret sauce, but I will tell you what has worked in a number of places. And I think it's really important that we do stay focused also on the positive, because there are so many great activists and political leaders around the world who are turning their societies back towards democracy, or for the first time towards democracy. What we saw in Poland really was a lot of democratically oriented political parties coming together. They didn't all agree on every policy issues, because no one ever agrees on every policy issue. But what they did agree on was it was important to strengthen Polish democracy. So they came together and they really decided we need to band together to try and be sort of a democratic majority. And they still have a lot of political issues to work out, a lot of policy differences to work out. But that's normal in a democracy, to have that messiness of policy differences. But what they have done is recapture the democratic trajectory of their country. What we see in a lot of countries, and I'll give the case of Guatemala, where there's really been a lot of groups, and here I would particularly call out women's groups and indigenous groups in Guatemala, who have said we will own and take back our democracy in an extraordinarily courageous way. Their country's been plagued by corruption, have been plagued by an infiltration of narco groups that have positioned themselves in power or supported leaders. They had a free and fair election where President Arevalo came to power. And when there was a push, literally until the night up until his inauguration, to keep him out of power, people went to the streets and they said, we're not doing this anymore. We are going to show you that we will stand for our democracy. So there's not really one clear path, one magic bullet, one magic wand. I wish there were. But I do think what it is, it's people saying, I am going to, in this moment, choose democracy. I'm going to choose to put democracy as the top priority. I will still care about all of the things that I care about personally, but I'm going to ensure that we have a strong, healthy democracy, which will allow me then to live freely and to live into the things which are most important for me.
I'm so glad you mentioned the role of women in Guatemala. We actually saw the same thing in Poland, the issue of reproductive rights. The regime had taken a very conservative turn, not only in terms of abortion, but birth control. And women played really an outsized role in that constellation of movements that came together to recapture their democracy. This seems to be more than a coincidence that women are so involved. Can you give some reasons why this might be the case? Why is it that women are sometimes very central in these, if you will, anti-authoritarian or in pro-democracy type movements?
There's lots of reasons for it. I think that people have given lots of different reasons. One is women are quite often aware of what the societal needs are, starting with a family and a household, but going up to the courtrooms and the medical offices and the business boardrooms. And so they're aware of really what it takes and where the pressures are on a society. And so they, understanding that and being close to that, both personally and professionally, women are also able and have been great powers of change to say, here's what we demand of our government. And we demand that our government also respond to us. We see a lot of places where women have been the target of discrimination. Afghanistan, Iran, so many places, also in Central America, where domestic violence and other crimes that are targeting women specifically are rampant. We see women saying, we know what this oppression looks like, and we know it is existential for us. And so we will go to the streets because this is not just a nice thing to have. This is really about whether we can live in our fullness as whole people. And I just look at the women of Afghanistan, the women of Iran, and women in so many countries who have in their little finger more courage than most of us will have in our entire life. And they are the ones that will bring change to their society, undoubtedly.
And it really spans ideological movements. You see the women in white, for example, in Cuba. You see it's really a very diverse phenomenon. It also seems that many of these regimes that take power are very toxic masculinity ventures, that they want to have women return to the home, that there's a certain machismo, a certain kind of dominance that they exude. And when women decide they don't like that, they don't want to go back to the home, I think there is a natural backlash. So it's interesting that you have these two phenomena that kind of operate in opposition. On one hand, a kind of a macho, sometimes even violent persona of these leaders. And then you have women who say, no, that's not what we want. That's not the kind of society we want to live in.
Absolutely. I also think there are many places where we work on political prisoners, for example, around the world, and there are men and women who are political prisoners. And what we know, women face very wide range of abuses and really horrific situations of political prisoners. But we also know that quite often when there are men there, the families behind the political prisoners who then become the most vocal activists, who become the people who go to the streets, who then take over and run for office. These are fierce, fierce activists. They are often mothers and wives and daughters who are the most vocal, passionate political leaders in their countries, because they understand while our loved one is away, we are the heart and soul of a country, and we are the ones who are going to lead the political change. And so I think we, as we look around the world, we see that women are really leading the charge in so many places. And it's both inspiring, but it is also a sign that there will be consistent change, because I do think that is an energy that is driving a lot of countries towards democracy.
I think for many generations, Americans looked at their government and they thought, well, whatever going on the rest of the world, the rest of the planet, we're kind of immune from these trends. We're America. We have a very different tradition. We're isolated by these two oceans. We stand apart from these trends. What Freedom House has documented is that part of the problem is the United States as well. This has been one of the backsliding countries. How closely do you see some of the similarities between American trends and some of these phenomena that we've talked about? How concerned are you that we're beginning to look more like these backsliding regimes and less like a pure, totally free, in the nomenclature of the Freedom House, democracies?
It's a great question. The reality is the United States is a democracy. And it is a democracy. And if you look even in the things that we have been challenged, as our score in the Freedom in the World report has dropped by 10 points over the last decade plus, we are still a democracy. And so some of the countries that I mentioned are either not free countries or they're partly free countries. So there's a difference in that we're starting also with a different foundational point, right? A different infrastructure, if you want to call it that. But the trends that we see are human trends that you see all around the world. People who are more committed to holding on to power and bending the rules of a democracy and care more about that than actually upholding a democracy. That is a human skill and a human condition that we see in every country. We see it in the United States, and it does resemble some things that we're seeing in other countries. And that's where we can look and learn from a number of cases around the world. I also want to go to a point which you started this question on, is also this idea that the United States could retrench and just live our own, what happens in America stays in America. The reality is we are in such an interconnected world. We're in a world where the security of the United States, where the economic prosperity of the United States, and our values, which are really universal values, those are all intricately intertwined with things around the world, right? And so where we see more democracies, we see more stable societies. Where we see more democracies, we see markets where our businesses and our people can go and invest, which helps us at home. We also see less times where we open up our feeds or open up our newspapers and see cases where we say those are violations of human rights, which I wouldn't want to ever even know exists. And so if we think that we can be a world where we will still be safe and we will be economically prosperous and we will live in a world that we want to live in and just ignore the rest of the world, we do that at our peril. The other piece of it is also the United States is a country that people still look to. And so when we violate democratic principles, when we do not act in a way that is consistent with the very principles upon which we were founded, which we have been perfecting and living into over many, many, many decades, when we do that, it is a sign to other countries around the world. And so if we think that we have things at home that can happen that have no impact around the world, we do that also at our own peril. I also think there are a lot of places around the world, even though the United States is not a perfect country, we were founded on wonderful ideals and we are trying to live into them more and more each day. People around the world still look and they ask, where is the United States going to stand? When the dictator in my country is doing X, or when I'm crying out for the rights that you all enjoy every day, where's the United States going to stand? And that's a really important question for us as Americans. I'm an American sitting in the United States. For us to really think about is we have a moral obligation and we have a self-interest for the rest of the world to live with the freedom that we enjoy every day. And for us both to work on what's going on at home, but also really to be a supporter of those around the world who are looking to bring that change to their countries.
If you're listening to this program or you're reading one of Freedom House's reports or you're reading Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post, you think to yourself, gosh, this is all very distressing, but I really can't do anything. I'm just, an ordinary citizen in one country. What do you tell individuals about their collective power and their responsibility to make sure that democracy doesn't backslide into authoritarian? What can average people do?
The first thing is for us to realize that in a democracy, the first four letters are demos, which means us. It means that our society is made of us, and we do have a lot of power to change that. We have the power. All of us are in organizations. How we choose to wield the organizational power or how we choose to lead organizations can either reflect democratic values or not. We are all part of a political system in the sense that we can be part of a political party. We can go to the ballot box. We can write to our congressperson. We can choose to ask those individuals who have been chosen to have power. We can choose those who are deeply democratic and deeply committed to democratic values. And we can push on those when we, in our own party or in other parties, to really also uphold what are democratic values. An important thing for all of us to remember is that however we show up, whether we're talking about whether we show up on social media, how we show up at our town halls, how we show up in our workplaces, how we show up in our political parties, we are choosing whether we are going to exemplify democratic values or not. Which means if we are interested in tearing down the system in order to advance our interest, we are part of the problem. So whatever party people belong to, whatever social group, whatever religious group, whatever labor group people belong to, if you are choosing to tear down the democratic fabric, if you're choosing to tear down the institutions in order to advance yours, then you are part of the problem. If you are choosing to say, look, we're going to get in the dirty, messy business of democracy and we're going to work on civil debate and we're going to work on trying to use the tools of power, strengthen them to figure out how we can move our society forward, you're reinforcing those sinews of democracy as you are also moving your own personal agenda forward. So we have so many opportunities to show up every day as democratic activists, whether that's our job, like those of us at Freedom House, or whether it's just a role that we play in the circles and spheres that we have influence.
One of the things that these regimes count on, I think, is paralysis, depression, cynicism. People get the sense that these guys, well, they sound like they're so strong. They tell us that there's no hope in resisting them. What is the kind of psychological stance that people have to assume in order to take on these forces? Because it can be kind of depressing. And sometimes the assaults come from a fire hose. There's one outrage directed against the press and another against labor unions and another against the courts. And then there's corruption. And it just seems like it's so much, there's nothing that can be done. Talk to us a little bit about the mindset that is important to maintain when all of this is kind of swirling around us.
I think it's important to take a historical mindset. I work for an organization that's been around 80 plus years and was founded during the Second World War. I'm also from a family that one of my parents grew up in a segregated country, the other one grew up during a war. And what I know is I'm living much better than all of my ancestors, in large part because people took the time, they took the choices to push for freedom every decade and every generation. It's hard. It's hard to do this every day, to wake up, be optimistic. But at the same time, if we look at the trajectory of human history, if we look at what's happened since 1945, when we started reporting there were just a handful of democracies. Even though we are in this 18-year rough patch, and it's very real and it's very intense and personal for many of us, we are also in a world that is more democratic and than it had been 50, 60, 70 years ago. And the only thing that has changed or that drove us to a place to have more democracies is that people chose to make individual decisions every day. And so it is hard. We need to accept that and name that and own that, but also to say we stand on the shoulders of people who have fought some very, very hard battles and have overcome some very, very real challenges to get us to a place where we are debating these issues. And we now have a responsibility and an opportunity to tough it out and to figure out where we find that optimism to hand off to the next generation a much better society than we even have.
I think that is so important, because one of the tools that these sorts of authoritarian figures use is nostalgia. They tell us that things are terrible now. They've never been as bad as they are. They want us to go back 40 or 50 years. And people's memories are jaded and sometimes juvenile in a sense. Most of us were children 50 years ago. So what we remember of the good old days may sometimes be very distorted. So I think one of the things that I take from what you're saying is the good old days may not have been so good after all. And be wary of people who want to take us back, because things have actually gotten better in general, both in our society and around the globe, in terms of prosperity, democracy, respect for human rights. So I don't mean to diminish or downplay people's happy childhood memories, but nostalgia can be a weapon in the hands of people who have in mind the undermining of democracy.
Absolutely. And I think for those people who want to undermine democracy, they will use any tool or any rhetoric or any motto. So, 50 years ago was great. 50 years in the future will be great. Tomorrow is great, or it's not going to be great. What we really have to do is to say, what is it that people want their society to look like? If there was something 50 years ago that you are so nostalgic for, let's name it. Let's name what it was about the society. And if there is something, then let's bring some of those values forward. What I like to do is really boil it down to what is the society that we want to live in, and how do we ensure that democratic infrastructure is going to be strong, so all of us, every single person in our society, can live with their rights respected, that there can be civil debate and civil discussions among people of differences, and that we can all share in that the security that comes from living in a democracy that is healthy and strong. So even when leaders want to paint a picture of, 50 years ago was great, I think we should scratch a little bit deeper and say, what is it? What is it that from there, because maybe there's something, I don't know, but what is it that you want to bring forward? Because right now we're in 2024 and we need to live with today's challenges and today's opportunities. What is it that the society we want to look at? And when someone is saying, if we wanted to have that glory day, we just need to take this opposition down, or we need to close down the courts, or we need to close down these media outlets, then that's where we then get down to the brass tacks and say, is that what the glory days are really about? What is it going to look like if we're in a society where there are no checks and balances, and where my personal rights maybe today are protected, but tomorrow I have no guarantees because we've dismantled the system that would protect me? I think that's where all of us have the intellectual responsibility and opportunity to push one notch further into that conversation and say, what is it exactly that we want our society to look like? And what is it going to take to come to that place? If I could just add one other thing.
Absolutely.
Quite often, we all complain about lots of things about democracy, but one of the important things about democracy is it gives us a system to resolve differences. It doesn't ever say that differences are going to go away. 300 million people, we're not going to get rid of all of them, let's be honest. But we can say there's going to be a system where I can bring my views, you can bring your views, we may agree, we may disagree, we may compromise, I might win, you might win the next time. The alternative to that messy, laborious system is violence. Because if I'm not going to have a system where you and I can debate each other and you can think the X and I can think Y, and then sometimes I'll win, sometimes you'll win. If we don't have that system and you and I don't trust the rules, my only way to advance my views over yours is usually through violence, or me repressing your views, or me silencing you. That's my only choice. I can either belong to a system or I can take it by force. And that's what I think all of us in every country, many people are living that every day. That is their lived experience. They know what that reality is. For those of us in democracies, we haven't always experienced that. But when you think about it, that is ultimately what is on the other side. That if we say we want to tear down a system, that system is there just to allow us to be able to compete on the right field against people that we differ with, some people that we agree with. And if we don't, then it really is each person for themselves, and it will be might makes right. And that's not a society. Trust me, I've traveled around the world. It's not a society that most people really want to live in.
I think that's so critical. And I think when people talk about violence, either from the state or they want to capitalize on violence from militia, thugs, criminal enterprises, red lights should go off, because I think your last point is perhaps the best one of all, that democracy is messy, but it's peaceful, and it leaves everyone with the opportunity to have their needs met, as opposed to being a victim of sheer violence. Nicole, thank you so much for coming on the program and for all that Freedom House does. I would encourage my listeners to go take a look at the website. You will be blown away by the amount of information and data. If you're interested in one country or one part of the world or one trend, it is just a wealth of information. And if you want to nerd out on democracy, that is the place to go. So thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Freedom House for everything that you do.
Thank you, Jen, for this and for all that you do to really bring great voices to the forefront and challenge us all to step into our democracy and re-own it and make it as strong as possible.
And that was Nicole Bibbins Sedaca. Fascinating, wasn't it? I think we get a few hints from what she had to say about where we're going and what we can do. The first is we should believe what Trump says. If he lays out a plan for subduing civilian protests with the military, for rounding up his opponents, for using a police state to throw out minorities, we should pay attention, because these people usually do what they say. Secondly, the only way of preventing such a person from coming to power is a unified opposition. That's what was possible in Poland. That's what was possible in Guatemala. It's what's possible in the United States. We have to put aside whatever differences we may have about Gaza, about the economy, about whatever issue, and understand that, as Ken Burns said in that magnificent graduation speech at Brandeis, there is nothing equal about this equation. There is only one choice. If we want to preserve democracy, if we want to make sure that there are future elections, there's only one viable choice. So it certainly gives us something to think about. And I think the comparison to other regimes that are backsliding into totalitarianism is a smart one to keep in mind. So remember, do your part, be involved, vote, and make sure that America doesn't follow the example of these other regimes. Bye-bye.